If you're brand new to Resolve, this is the video for you. If you're brand new to video editing, we're going to be moving a little bit fast. I recommend checking out this video if you want to learn the very basics of how video editing works at all. Let's say maybe you have some experience with some other editing apps. You're not a total noob to video production, but you've never really opened Resolve. You don't know what the whole hubbub is, whatever the hubbub means. Well, I'm going to teach you all the basic things you need to know in order to open up Resolve 18 and start making awesome videos. Are you down for that? I'm also down for that. Let's go. First things first, what the heck is Davinci Resolve? Well, it is a video editor, but it's more than a video editor. You can do editing, but you can also do color correction and advanced audio editing, as well as effects. Basically everything that you would normally use a whole suite of software for, it's all kind of built into one program. It's been the standard for color correction for years and years, and it's quickly becoming a monster of a program that can do absolutely anything that you want to do in post-production, and it's all built together in one tool. Resolve comes in two versions. There's Davinci Resolve, which is the free version, and then there's Davinci Resolve Studio, which is the paid version. The free version, honestly, is amazing for almost anything that you want to do. If you are rendering at UHD or below, and you don't need like a ton of super fancy, really specific effects, you can download the free version. You can use it for commercial work. There's no trial period. There's no watermark. It has all of the pages that we're going to explore today, and it's literally just amazing. And it's free. The studio version is a one-time purchase of $295. There's no subscription or anything like that. And you can render above 4K. And there are some fancy effects that you get. One of them being the noise reduction, which is really, really good to like take out visual noise like from videos. That's a major reason why people upgrade most of the time. And it also takes a little bit more advantage of your hardware. So if you have multiple graphics cards, Studio will give you more choices on kind of how you use your hardware. If you're just getting into Resolve, I would recommend downloading the free version, seeing if you like it, cutting a few projects with it, and you can open up any of your projects from the free version of Resolve in the Studio. If you ever want to upgrade, you can even open up Studio projects in the free version, and it'll just have a watermark on anything that is only available in the Studio version, like if you use a specific effect or whatever. So yeah, if you want to follow along, go ahead and download the free version. And if you're wondering if there's a catch, there really isn't. I've been using the free version of Resolve for a really long time. I do have the Studio version because there are some cool things in there, but honestly, the free version is amazing. In this demo, I'm going to be using Davinci Resolve Studio 18 beta. It's in beta at the time of recording this video. So in the future, if Resolve 18 looks a little different, that's probably why, but nothing should change too much. If you want to follow along, I would get this one right here, Davinci Resolve 18 beta. Once you download and install Davinci Resolve and you open it for the first time, it's going to look something like this. You're going to have this window pop up. This is called our project manager. This is where all of your projects are stored. So you can make a new project, open an old project, import and export projects, anything like that kind of happens here. Something to note in the upper left-hand corner, we have these three icons: local, network, and cloud. Most of the time you'll be working on local. That just means that you're working on your computer like you normally would with a piece of software. Network allows you to share projects over your network if you have kind of a specific server set up, which is, kind of advanced. But you can set this up in your local network if you're, in a production house or whatever, and you can have multiple people working on the same project at the same time and have it just private to your own network. A new thing that they added in Resolve 18 is the cloud, and this is kind of the same idea as the network, except for it works online. So you can make a project and you can share it with somebody who's anywhere in the world, and you can both work on the same project at the same time. So somebody can be editing in New York while somebody takes the clips that they're editing and color grades them on the same project in LA, which is just nuts. I do have a couple videos exploring this, but for now we're going to go to local. And just to show you around a little bit, I'm going to open a project that I had here. And when you open up Resolve, it's going to look something like this. If you have a new project, you won't have all of these clips here, but this will be the interface. And this interface right here is called the cut page. If you look down below, there are these big buttons on the lower part of the screen, and each one of these switches out the interface of Resolve to do different stuff. These are what we call pages of Resolve. And each page has a specific job for post-production. So we're dropped into the cut page, but we're actually going to start with the edit page here. The edit page is pretty much what you would think of as a normal editor. So something like Adobe Premiere or Final Cut Pro or Vegas, everything that you could do in something like that, that's what you do in the edit page. This is where you put together timelines, put together edits, and kind of build your project. The cut page has a similar function, but it kind of goes about it in a different way, and we're going to explore that here in a few minutes. The Fusion page is all about effects. So something that you would use After Effects or Apple Motion or some kind of compositor, that's what Fusion is for. This is where you would clone stuff out or do green screen or lightsabers or muzzle flashes or composite explosions, add fog, those kind of things. This is also where you'd make motion graphics, templates, lower thirds, titles, that kind of stuff. We'll switch to the color page. The color page is all about color correction. Rather than having an effect on the edit page that you would have to add to each clip, we have this whole interface that is designed for color. And again, this is really like the Hollywood standard for color correction. It's arguably the best color correction app out there. Then we also have the Fairlight page, which is super advanced, really detailed audio editing. So you can get as crazy as you want with your audio and adjust things here that you would normally use something like Pro Tools or Adobe Audition or Logic. This is where you get into the nitty-gritty of all of your audio and apply things like equalizers and effects and all those kind of things. To the far right, we have the Deliver page. And this is where you actually export your project so people can see what the heck you made. This is a lot like Adobe Media Encoder. Basically, you set your settings for your movie. There are a bunch of presets up here. So if you want to create something for YouTube, you can click on the YouTube preset. You can even upload directly to YouTube if you want to. All you have to do is sign into your account in the preferences. And yeah, this is kind of where you render things. On the far left, we also have our media page. This is where you can browse to media on your system and you can import it into your project. You can organize media into bins. You can add all kinds of metadata and you can get organized. Now that we have a pretty good idea of how Resolve is laid out, let's get a little bit deeper. First thing I'm going to do is make a new project. In the lower right-hand corner, we have this house button. And when we click on that, that brings up our project manager. If I want to make a new project, I click on this new project button right here, and we'll call this Crash Course Project 2. Add a couple practice projects here, and I'll hit create. And now we have our blank project. I'm going to start out in the edit page because pretty much if you've used a editor before, this should already look pretty familiar. We have the two viewers here and we have the timeline down below. And over here on the left is our media pool. The media pool is where everything lives for our project. So this is where we import media, kind of organize things into bins. Everything has to be in here in order to be used in our project. So we can get media in here a couple ways. I could right click and go to import media. And I can select any footage I want to bring in and hit open. And it'll ask me if I want to change the frame rate to the frame rate that I shot with. And if I don't, I'll hit don't. And if I do want to change it, I'll hit change. That will set my project settings to the settings of these clips. Things pretty much work how you would expect. If you double click on a piece of media, that'll bring it up here in this source viewer and you can scrub through it. You can set an in and an out with I and O on the keyboard for the beginning and the end of the clip. I can drag this down into the timeline to make a new timeline. And here's where we put together our story. And the thing I like about this, especially coming from other programs, is that it's really intuitive. If you've used Premiere or Final Cut or Vegas or whatever, you can pretty much kind of guess how things work. You can double click on something, bring it down. You can move clips up and down in layers. If you mouse over the edge of a clip, it lets you trim it. And one thing to mention is that this tool, this normal pointer tool, is called the just normal selection mode. And depending on where you kind of mouse over on the clip, it kind of changes to do different things, right? So if I'm over the left side of a clip and I have this left bracket, I can trim a clip. I can bring this in. If I click in between two clips, I can kind of roll this back and forth. Again, it should make a ton of sense if you've edited before. If you're already confused about kind of how to edit and how to put things together in the timeline, make sure to click the link in the description for my Editing for Noobs video, please. That'll explain all the basics. And then if you want to, you can come back to this video later. A couple things that are a little bit different about Resolve. When you double click on a clip and you have it loaded here into this source viewer, you can add it to the timeline a few different ways. Of course, I can have my in my out set. I can drag this down. That's one way, but there's also these buttons right here, and these will put this clip into my timeline in a couple different ways. One would be insert, which is going to put it right where the playhead is, just like this. We also have overwrite, which is going to put it right where the playhead is, and it's going to go over any clips that are in the way. and it's going to delete them. And then we also have replace clip, which if I'm over a clip like this and hit replace, it's going to replace whatever that clip was with this clip. And so now we show just a little bit of that clip instead of the one that we had just now of the tree. The other way we can put this down in the timeline is by grabbing it and dragging it over to the right over the timeline viewer. And here we see we have these little pop-up things. And depending on which one of these I drop it on, it will do different things in the timeline. So if I say place on top, that will put it on the layer above. And they do all kinds of various things. One that I really like is append at end. That's this one down here. If I click on that, no matter where my playhead is, it will just throw this at the very end of the sequence. So that's really great for doing something like building a rough cut. I can just hit I and O and then append at end. Same thing, I, O, append to end, and I can kind of go through and do it that way. I can even set a keyboard shortcut to append at end. By the way, if you're wanting to set keyboard shortcuts, go up to the upper left-hand corner where it says Davinci Resolve and go down to keyboard customization, and you have all different ways to be able to do that here. You can either start by clicking the button on the keyboard here and then looking up what that key does, or you can search by command, make sure that you have all commands selected here, and then you can search for something like overwrite, and you can look up what it's set as. You can even hit this plus and set a new keyboard shortcut. So if I want H to be overwrite, I can type in H there. And now whatever I have set here, if I hit H, that will overwrite it and go down into the timeline like that. What I like to do is set append at end to P. The only reason being that it's right next to I and O. And so I can just go I, O, P, and then grab this next one, I, O, P, and you can really move through things pretty quick that way. We're actually going to do something kind of like this in the cut page here in a second. That's how you get clips into the timeline and how you do some keyboard shortcuts. If you're looking to slip clips, you can use this trim mode right here. Click on trim edit mode. And what this will do is if you grab the middle of the clip, it will slip it back and forth. If you grab the middle but towards kind of the bottom, you can slide the clip. And then also, if you grab the edge like this, it will kind of move everything with that edit, which is really handy. Because normally with the selection mode, if I move this over, it's going to kind of overwrite the clip. If I move it to the left, it's going to give us a gap. But if I hit T on the keyboard, which is the same as just clicking this little trim edit mode, and I move back and forth like this, it's going to kind of keep everything together. Really nice way to kind of quickly shorten things down and adjust your clips. Very, very nice tool. We also have the blade edit tool right here, just like razor blade in any editing app you might use. One thing that I like to do a lot in Resolve is split things at the playhead, which by default is Control \. That's the slash above the return key, and that will just split it at the playhead. So I do a lot of that. There's also a command that will basically kind of trim this like that all the way to the playhead, and that's Control Shift right bracket. And you can trim the beginning of a clip with Control Shift left bracket. That's called ripple end to playhead and ripple start to playhead, which I like to set as Q and W. So Q will just kind of do this sort of thing, like this, Q, and the end would be W, like that. So between Q and W, I can really trim things really quickly. Really nice way to work. A couple other things to notice here. I can turn on and off snapping by toggling this little button right here, the little magnet. I can also hit N on the keyboard for snap. And the other one is linked selection. So this kind of gets people sometimes. Let's say we have a piece of media with attached audio. By default, if you grab this and move it around, the audio is attached to it. And that's because the audio and the video are linked. And you have this little chain link if it's linked to something. So you could right click on it and uncheck link clips like that. And then I can grab this and move it around. Or I can also just disable this chain link icon right here. And that will not really listen to the fact that they're linked. And so that's really nice to be able to do just really quickly if you want to, say, trim your audio without your video or vice versa, but you don't necessarily want them to go out of sync at any point. You can kind of do that and then just turn the link back on, and now you're good. One thing that I think is handy is position lock. So if you like kind of where things are, but you might be just selecting something and adding effects or, adjusting sound volume or something like that, you can click on this position lock, and what that'll do is not let you move the clips back and forth or up and down. It just kind of locks your clips, but you can still select them and adjust attributes about them. Speaking of adjusting attributes, anytime that you have something selected in the timeline or even anywhere in Resolve really, you can adjust its properties in the inspector. Up here in the upper part of the screen, we have these buttons. And all of these buttons either open or close a panel in the interface. And this upper right one is called the inspector. And if I turn that on, that opens up the inspector right here. And now for whatever I have selected, I can adjust the properties with these little sliders and numbers and stuff. Cool thing about the inspector is that it's more than just the properties. You can actually add some kind of basic effects. I can do lens correction, I can do stabilization, I can do all these crazy things. And all you have to do is click on it once to kind of open up this little menu for each of these items. And there's just a ton of stuff that you can do with whatever you have selected. And it's context sensitive, right? So if I'm not looking at anything or I don't have anything selected, there's nothing there. If I select a piece of media here in the media pool, I can adjust its properties here in the inspector. If I have something selected down in the timeline, I can adjust its properties in the inspector. And both of these panels, the media pool and the inspector, show up in just about every page of Resolve. And so it's good to get used to them. Basically, anything that you have selected, you adjust in the inspector. Your media pool has all of your media in it. And actually, there's some kind of viewer in every page as well. So now you know a lot of Resolve just by learning these 3 panels. Pretty cool. So I'll take a second and load up a project I've been working on for this demo. And here we have a little edit of kind of a little commercial, and let's explore this a little bit. I have my edit laid out in my timeline, just like you would think. I have my voiceover down here in the audio tracks. One thing to note is that this voiceover is a mono audio clip, and so I had to put it on a mono audio track. You can right click on any of these tracks and change type to be whatever kind of channel configuration you want. So mono, stereo, 5.1, whatever. So this first track is mono, but this second track is stereo because this is our music. You can kind of keep yourself organized by selecting whatever you want in the track, right-clicking, and going to clip color, and you can change the color of these clips and have kind of a visual representation of, differences and stuff in the timeline if you want to. And like I said, it really kind of just works the way that you would think it would work if you've used any kind of editing app. To add a title, you can go up to where it says effects here and click on that so it's bright white. And then that will pop up our effects panel. And we have all kinds of transitions and generators and effects and filters and everything to put on any of our clips, including titles like just plain text. I can drag this in just like you would think I would. I can look at it by putting my playhead over it. I can select it and adjust its properties here in the inspector. I can adjust the font and size and color and all of that stuff. I can even add a drop shadow, a background, all these kind of properties that are built into that text title. And if I go over to settings here, these are the properties that you would normally get with just kind of a video clip, right? So transforming, cropping, all of that kind of stuff. Something to note about these titles is these kind of upper titles. These are just kind of the plain text stuff that's available in the edit page. But down below, we have Fusion titles. So these are titles that are usually animated and they use the power of the Fusion page. So we'll learn about the Fusion page here in a minute, but those are basically a little bit fancier. They also take a little bit more horsepower to render. So depending on the complexity of the title, you might be seeing things kind of lag a little bit. Might not be too bad, depends on your system. Under titles, we have generators. So we can generate just a solid color or a gradient or all these kind of things. And again, just take them and drag them into the timeline just like you would a video clip. And that's how those work. If you want to put an effect on something or a filter, you take it and drag it onto a clip just like you think you would. And that's how that works. You can select the clip that you drag it onto and go over to the inspector. And here under the effects tab, you can adjust any of the effects that you've put on there. You can stack multiple effects. You can turn them on and off with this little toggle switch. This is just set up in what I think is a pretty intuitive way. If you want to add a video transition or an audio transition, it's here in the effects panel under video transitions. I can grab any of these dissolves and I can drag them to right in between a couple clips and it'll kind of show me. And I'll drag that and I can select it like this. And if it turns red, then I can adjust it here in the inspector again. So I can preview this and it works pretty well. Another thing to mention just about moving around in the timeline is you can, of course, take your playhead and kind of move it around like this. There's this little zoom bar here, and this will let you zoom in or out really quickly. You can hit minus to zoom out and plus to zoom in. What I like to do is hold down Alt on the keyboard and roll with my scroll wheel on my mouse to zoom out or in. I can also hold Shift and scroll up or down to size my tracks, either my video tracks up here or my audio tracks down here. If I hold Control and scroll left or right, it moves it back and forth. And so that's a nice way to be able to, hold down Alt, hold down Shift, and I can kind of move around that way. One really essential thing for moving around in Resolve is to have a 3-button mouse. So that's a mouse with a scroll wheel that you can click down in the middle. I can click down on my middle button on my mouse, on my scroll wheel, and I can kind of grab this and move this back and forth. And that's a really nice way to kind of move in the timeline. I can grab this middle button and just drag this around. The same thing goes for the viewers. I can zoom in or out just by rolling with the scroll wheel, and I can middle button mouse click and drag to kind of pan around in my viewer. So again, 3-button mouse, really important. Audio clips work just like you think they would. You can trim them, move them around, use the trim tools, everything that you would do with the video clips. If you mouse over sort of the middle, there's this white line, and you can move this up or down to adjust the volume. That's the same thing as adjusting the volume here in the inspector. If we have this selected, that's this volume slider right here. In the inspector, you can also adjust things like pan, pitch, and they even have a clip equalizer, which is really neat. If you want to just add a quick EQ to a clip, you can do that. And one thing I'll point out is that at the end of any video or audio clip, there's this little white handle. You can grab this and move this way to add a quick fade. And you can adjust the shape of the fade with this little white dot. I can push this down and kind of have this fade down kind of gradually, whatever you feel like doing. But that's how you do something like a really long fade in or out on the audio. And it also works for the video, but the tracks have to be a certain size first. So if you zoom up like this, then you can fade this in and it'll fade in from black. So that's a great way to do it without having to drag a crossfade onto it or something like that. There's a lot more details in the edit page. There's a lot we could probably go over, but that's really the basics. Again, if you've used an app like Premiere or Final Cut or something where you have kind of an interface like this with the 2 viewers and the timeline, this should make a ton of sense. This part of Resolve, in my opinion, is maybe not the most boring. I think it's really functional and it works really well. I'd say it's certainly as good or better than the other editing apps out there. I edit all of my projects in the edit page. I don't use Premiere or anything like that. And it's just a really well done, very functional editing app. But the real beauty about Resolve is that this timeline is shared by all of the other pages. So at any point, if I want to do something fancy, I can just switch into Fusion and do some fancy compositing. I can switch over to the color page and do my color correction. I can switch over to Fairlight and get really detailed with my audio. And I don't have to round trip or export or anything like that. It's just a great environment to work in. Now let's take a look at the cut page. I can get to the cut page by just clicking on the cut button down here. And that will open up my timeline here in the cut page. Now, something to notice is that this right here is the exact same timeline as my edit page. It's the same sequence, same clips, same audio, same everything. This is just kind of a different way to look at it and work with the clips. And that's common with all of the pages in Resolve. If I were to go to color, this is the same timeline. These are all the clips from my timeline. Fairlight, same thing. This is my timeline. Here's all the clips. And so that's what's really neat about Resolve is you can just bring things into kind of these different workspaces and get a little bit more detailed, kind of do what those spaces were designed to do. So let's take a look at the cut page. The cut page is a lot like the edit page, but it has kind of a fundamental difference in approach. The big difference is that the cut page is built for speed. The edit page, this is kind of built like a traditional editor, right? You find clips in the media pool, you load them into your source viewer, you bring them into the timeline, you chop them up, move them around, that kind of thing. If you want to get detailed, you zoom all the way in. If you want to look at the whole thing, you zoom all the way out. But with the cut page, there are a lot of things that are kind of stripped out to save you time. This is really kind of designed for a workflow like news or like making a vlog, something like that. It's something that you want to get done really, really quickly. That might not be that complicated. So you could edit a feature film in the edit page and it would make a ton of sense to do that, but maybe not in the cut page. The cut page is really designed for if you want to put together a wedding video during the reception so that the bride and groom can see a quick cut of the video. It's for really fast turnaround stuff that doesn't have to be super complicated. So let's take a look at the interface. Let's start with the familiar. On the left, we have the media pool. This acts pretty much like the media pool does in the other pages. If you double click on something, you can open it up in the viewer. This is where you can look at all of your clips, you can organize them, move them into bins and that kind of thing. One little difference is that you don't have a list of bins here. If you enter a bin like this, it just gives you these little breadcrumbs up here, but pretty much the same idea. This is how you import stuff. If you double click on something, it goes into the viewer here, and there's only one viewer. This viewer switches in between the source and the timeline viewer depending on what you have selected. So if you double click something here in the media pool, it'll switch to the source viewer. If you click down into your timeline, it'll switch to the timeline viewer. And you can toggle this by these little buttons right here. This middle button is, I would say, my major reason for using the cut page. If you click on this, this is source tape. Source tape, what that does is it takes all of your footage from whatever bin you're in, and it lines it out one after another in one kind of timeline here. And you can quickly scrub through all of your footage, and you can see everything that you have. This is a great way to build a rough cut, kind of like we did in the edit page. In fact, a lot of the time I find myself, if I'm just looking for B-roll or kind of making a video like this, I'll flip into the cut page to make a rough cut, and then I'll switch over to the edit page to get a little bit more detailed. The other big thing you'll notice about the cut page is that there are two timelines. This upper timeline is the completely zoomed out view of our project. So if I click at the beginning, that's the very beginning of our timeline. And at the end, that's the very end of our timeline. There is no zooming in or out. In the bottom, this is the zoomed in view. And the zoomed in view, the lower timeline, moves under the playhead. And in the upper timeline, the playhead moves around. And so it's kind of weird. It's kind of something you have to get used to. You can actually unlock your playhead by clicking this button right here. And you can move the playhead around in the lower timeline as well. So if that's something that you'd like to do, I like to have it locked because then it doesn't get confusing with two playheads moving around. I just have this one here, and then the other one I can see the progress of my movie. And I like having that kind of visual difference. Pretty much the idea here is that you can quickly navigate to the beginning of your movie in the upper timeline, and then you can make adjustments really quickly in the lower timeline, and you don't have to zoom in or out. You can just quickly do what you need to do depending on how detailed it needs to be. This upper timeline, I can actually make edits in. I can grab things and trim them. I can move them around. It's not just a map of the sequence, it's actually a timeline. It's just real small. So generally you'll do this if you want to like take a clip and put it at the very end of the timeline, you can do that in the upper timeline. Whereas if you want to do a trim or something, you do that in the bottom timeline. I'll just hit Control Z a couple times. The other thing to note is just like in the edit page, when we switch to trim edit mode, if I grab the edge of something, it's going to want to not have a gap. And so it's going to kind of move things around the very best that it can. And sometimes that can mess you up. Like if I were to trim this way, see we're cutting off some of our audio in our VO. And so that same thing happens by default in the cut page. So if you have something with multiple layers and multiple different pieces of audio and you trim something like this, it's automatically in trim mode and it's going to be overwriting a bunch of your clips if you're not careful. So the kind of edit that you would do in the cut page is generally one that's really simple, that's just one line of clips, preferably clips that have on-camera audio. Again, something like a vlog or a news story where you have the microphone plugged into the camera so that you don't have to kind of sync things up. That's a great thing to edit in the cut page. So let's make a new timeline. I'll just right click in the media pool and say create new timeline. We'll just say create. And what I generally like to do in the cut page, like I said, is double click on my clips, bring those up and bring up our source tape. And remember how we set our keyboard shortcuts to I, O, and P earlier? I can quickly say I, O, P, and go through and add these to the timeline. And it's really, really fast. And you can build a rough cut really quickly this way, especially if it's B-roll, if it's just visual, super nice. Again, those are custom shortcuts, but you can also set your in and your out like this, and then click on one of these buttons down here. And these are very similar to the overlay buttons in the edit page. These right here. And that they take whatever clip you have selected, whatever ins and outs you have set, and it will put that in the timeline in various different ways. One thing that's a little different is that we don't have insert, we have smart insert. Because again, everything's kind of made for speed. And so you'll notice this little animated arrow thing. What that's doing is marking the nearest edit point, the nearest kind of break in the footage. And it's saying if you do something that's going to look for an edit point, it's going to happen right here. So this smart insert looks for the nearest edit point, and then it will insert this piece of footage right there at that edit point. So if I click on smart insert, that's what it'll do. So it throws that clip in between the other two clips. And as I move the playhead around, we can see it highlights different edit points. And so again, it's really nice if you're wanting to move fast because you don't have to line this up like perfectly on the edit point if you want to put a clip in between two other clips. Whereas normally on an insert, if you have it off a little bit, it'll put a little bit of this clip before and the rest of the clip after, and it's just not great. The other thing that's built for speed are the transitions. Those are these buttons right here. If we click on dissolve, what this will do is find the nearest edit point, which is this one. And as we click that, that'll add a cross dissolve right here. So again, really fast to kind of go through and just get kind of near that edit point, and you can add a dissolve. If you don't want the dissolve, you can switch to cut and build your project that way. The other thing that the cut page is surprisingly very good at is multicam. I'm gonna go ahead and import some footage here. I'm gonna hit File, Import Bin. And this is just a bin of multicam footage that I have from one of our premium trainings. And I'll double click on that to open it up and open up our cut page media. And here we have a multicam shoot of a production meeting. And let's say we want to do a multicam edit on this. Well, I can select all of my footage that I know goes together and click on this little button up here, which is Sync Clips. And as I do that, it's going to bring up all the clips that it wants to sync, and I'm going to sync it by audio. And let's see how it goes. I'll hit Sync. And now it's gone through and it's listened to the audio on every one of those clips, and it put them together in a timeline, kind of stacked all in sync, even with this external audio. If we're pretty confident everything is synced, we can just hit Save Sync. If we need to fix something, we can click on this little button right here to unlock the sync, and we can move things around if we need to. But I'm gonna lock that sync and hit Save Sync. And now we get this little blue badge on the top as everything is synced together. Really what we've done is we told Resolve that, hey, all of these go together, and Resolve has remembered kind of how they relate to each other. So now if we want to do a multicam edit, we can take any of these clips. Let's just start with kind of the wide, and I can drag this down into our timeline. And I don't have to have these all together in the timeline because Resolve sort of remembers. And now what I can do is go over to the sync bin, click on that right here, and I can do a couple things. As I play through the sequence here, I see kind of my multicam sequence kind of play right here. But the thing that I really like to do that I think is super powerful is just clicking on a camera. That'll bring that up full screen. And you can kind of scrub through and just find the interesting parts, right? So like any part in this camera where he kind of starts to point to something, I'll just hit an in and an out right there. And then I can hit this button, Source Overwrite. And what that will do is find exactly where that clip is supposed to go, and it will just put that in the timeline. And it bases it on this bottom clip here. So now if we go back to our timeline viewer, we can cut into exactly where we need. So that makes it really quick to just find the clips that are interesting on one camera and just put those where they go. So again, we'll just find some interesting clips here. So here's one, in, out, source overwrite, and that's just gonna put that wherever it needs to go here in my sequence. So it makes these edits actually a lot quicker than going through and watching the whole thing and having to live switch it. Really cool way to work. If you do like the cut page, there are a lot of things you can do. You can add titles, you can add effects, you can add transitions. There's even kind of a cool interface for the properties of whatever you have selected, kind of like the inspector, but it's a little bit more visual. You can do things like crop and adjust things kind of right here in this on-screen interface. Very cool. But yeah, that's pretty much the cut page. So before we get into the Fusion Color Fairlight pages, I want to take a second and check out the media page. At the very bottom of our interface, all the way to the left, is our media page. This is one of those pages that some people are going to love and some people are just never going to use. We have our media pool down here. It's not on the left anymore. It's kind of down in the bottom, but it works the same way. This is where all of our media lives for our project. We have a source viewer up here where we can preview our footage. But in the upper left here, we have our media storage. And what this is just a browser for your system. So I can go through the files on my hard drive and I can really easily preview things, play them back without having to import them into Resolve. Something some people run into is they kind of get used to looking at stuff here and they're like, all right, yeah, now I want to use this in my timeline. And then they go over to the edit page and they're like, where'd it go? Well, again, these are just on your system, and so you have to drag them down into your media pool in order for them to show up in the media pool in the other pages. So I'll just get rid of that real quick. And the media page is really great if you like getting organized in metadata, that kind of thing. If I double click on a clip here, it brings up my metadata here in this lower right-hand corner. I can close out our audio meters by hitting audio right there. And in the metadata panel, we can look at all this information about our clips. And if I go to the upper right-hand corner, click on this little drop down and go to all groups or shot and scene, I have a ton of metadata that I can edit for this clip. So I can add a description, I can add comments, I can add clip color or flag a clip a certain way. Something that I like to do if we're shooting like a short film or something is I can go through all of my clips here, and if we have footage that we shot actually with a slate, is I can write down the information from the slate here in our metadata. Then we can sort and organize by that kind of metadata in the media pool later. Really, really helpful. And what's cool is I can select multiple shots here. So these are everything at sunset, and I can add a sunset keyword to all of these, and I can just scroll down and hit save. And now each of these will have a sunset keyword. I'll right click down here and make a smart bin, which is basically like a folder that will only show clips that meet a certain filter. So I can say sunset clips, and I can say keywords contains sunset. I can even have this show in all projects. So when I make a new project, it already has these filters kind of built up. I can hit create, and now these are only the sunset clips, which is pretty cool. Normally, if you put in a keyword, it'll automatically make a smart bin under this keywords category, although that's not working on my system under this build for some reason. But normally that's a thing, so you wouldn't even have to do this. But you can make a smart bin that sorts by clip or scene or something like that if you want to. Really powerful way to be organized. Those are the major need to know things in the media page. Some people will love this page, some people will flat out ignore it, and either way is totally fine. Let's switch back to our original project here. And let's just start working through the rest of the pages. The next page over is the Fusion page. And what that will do when you click the Fusion page is it will load whatever clip you were on into the Fusion page so that you can do effects and compositing and things on it. Again, all the pages in Resolve share a timeline. And so we can actually go up to our buttons here in the upper left and click on clips. And that'll bring up all the clips in our timeline. So we could actually go through here and switch clips and kind of do effects on any of the clips that we need to. That's kind of one of the major ways that you get a clip into Fusion to actually start working on it. The other thing you can do is if you're in the media pool in any of the pages, you can right click in the blank space and go down and click New Fusion Composition. And what this will do, we'll call this Fusion Comp 1, and I'll hit Create. And then that will place that here in the media pool. And if you double click on it, that's going to open up this kind of blank Fusion composition here in Fusion. Now, this Fusion composition will live in our media pool. It doesn't live in our timeline. It's kind of a separate thing. This is great for something that you want to build kind of reusable graphics, or, something that you don't necessarily want to just live in a specific timeline. So let's open up a shot here in Fusion. I'm going to use this third shot right here. All I have to do is be over it here in the edit page and then click on Fusion, and that will load it up. I'll reset our layout here so everybody's looking at the same thing. And let's take a look at the interface. The very first thing here is the viewer, and this right viewer here is by default what the person who watches your movie is going to see, much like the timeline viewer. But that's not necessarily always true, and we'll get to that in a second. We also have a viewer here on the left, and we can choose a few different ways to view things here. Here on the right is our inspector, which is open by default in the Fusion page because you work a lot with the inspector in the Fusion page. Down below our viewers, we have our transport controls and our tools. Now, this isn't a tool that you click and it changes what your mouse cursor does. These are actually tools that you can kind of click and drag down into this space down here, which is called the node flow. I'll go ahead and hit delete here, and we'll talk about nodes. So again, Fusion does compositing. Basically what that means is putting things over other things, combining images together, trying to accomplish certain effects, adjusting images, that kind of thing. And the way that Fusion does this is with something called nodes. Nodes are sort of like a flowchart, and each node basically does one thing. Each little box here is a node, and it has one major job. This left box by default is media in 1, and what that does is it takes the clip from our timeline. So when we click into the Fusion page, all it does is just grab this clip that we're over, and it brings it here into Fusion World. And that'll allow us to mess with it and add effects and add other images and all that stuff. But that's all that media in 1 does, is it just opens that image. Now, if we follow along on this little flowchart, we go from this little white square, which is the output, all the way into this yellow triangle, which is the input of our media out 1. Media out, all it does is take this image that we're feeding into it, and it puts it back into the timeline. All of the fancy stuff that we do is going to be by adding nodes here in the middle between media in and media out. So if I want to blur this image, I can grab the blur tool, which is to the left of this second divider, this little teardrop. I can grab this and then drag it down in between these two nodes and drop it on this pipe when it turns blue. And now we have this blur effect in between our media in 1 and our media out 1. And if I move this around, I can see this is definitely attached to those two nodes. So let's take a look at our image. Well, it doesn't look that blurry. The reason for that is because we haven't upped our blur size in the inspector. So I can push up the blur size and now I have a blurry image. The reason my blur controls are right here is because I have this blur node selected. And that's really how nodes work, is you start typically on the left in Fusion, but you don't have to. You can actually go the other way if you want to. It's all about where this white square output, what that is connected to, which is generally an input of another node. So this is the blur input of the blur node. And then the blur node takes that blurry image and it outputs it into media out 1. So we have a very simple set of instructions here. Take the image, blur it, and put it back into the timeline. So now, if we switch back to our edit timeline, we have a blurry image. Makes sense. And there are a few different kinds of nodes that exist here in Fusion. This blur node is an example of an effect node. An effect is something that you run an image through. I like to say it like that because it helps you kind of remember how to hook these things up. We have our starting image and that kind of goes through this blur effect and it makes a blurry image. I'll select this and hit delete, and I can grab a color corrector node and do the same thing. I'll run this media in through this color corrector and it will change the colors. And there are a few different kind of effects nodes. Generally, anything that kind of messes with the image itself is an effect node. So blurs, color correction, distortions, those kind of things. A lot of those nodes you can find here on this kind of second section of our tools, but that's one type of node. Another type of node is an image node or a generator node, and it's a node that creates an image of some kind. So this media in node is actually kind of an image node, because what it's doing is grabbing this image from the timeline and it's using that image for things. On the far left of our tools here, we can grab this one, which is called a background. And what that will do, if I hook this up to our media out, is it makes a black background. If I select the node and then change its color, we'll have that color of background. So again, it has one job. It makes a colored background. And you can adjust exactly what that background looks like with the inspector. Similar thing would be generating text. So this node generates text. I'll just hook this up to media out. And just like the text title in the edit page, it makes some text. And so it's really kind of creating a new image from nothing that is just this text on transparent. Now, let's notice something. We can't see anything that we're doing here unless it's hooked up to this media out node. That means that this media in, which was our original image, if we go back to the edit page, we're not going to see that anymore. We're just going to see our text. That's because it's not hooked up to our media out. If we were to unhook the text and hook back our media in 1, we'd see our image, but we wouldn't see that text. Again, if we went back to the edit page, here we just see our image without the text. So you have to hook up a node to the media out in order to see it in your edit. Let's talk about these viewers here. This right-hand viewer, by default, is kind of like the timeline viewer. It's what the person who watches your project is actually going to see. But the only reason that's true is because we have our media out node loaded into our second viewer here. We're choosing to look at whatever our media out looks like in this right-hand viewer. The reason I know that is because 1, it says it up here, media out 1. But we also have this little indicator below the node that has a white dot on the right. That means that this is viewing on the right view. I can click on this dot to the left, and I can view this on my left side as well. I can even unhook my right view and only view it on the left. See, each of these viewers can display any node that we want in our node flow. A quick keyboard shortcut is if you select a node and hit 1 or 2 on the keyboard, that will load that into the first or second viewer. And this is great if you want to see something that might not necessarily be hooked up to your media out yet. What I generally like to do is select my media out and load that in the second viewer because I like this right-hand viewer to be kind of like the timeline viewer. And then I'll look at different parts of our composition by selecting nodes and hitting 1 on the keyboard so I can view the different things that they're doing. This is especially helpful when you start to hook nodes up together and get more complicated, right? If I take this text and I run it through a blur, I'll make this really blurry, you'll see this isn't getting blurry at all. The reason is we're viewing this text before it hits the blur in this left viewer. If I select the blur node and hit 1, now we're going to see that blurry text. So this is great to view kind of different parts of your composition and isolate things, because pretty quickly, the more nodes that you add, the more it can get a little bit confusing. So this is a tool to help you break things down a little bit. So if Fusion is a compositing program, and compositing is like putting something over something else, combining images and stuff, how do we do that? Well, something that you'll notice is that there aren't any layers. If you've ever used After Effects or Photoshop or like some image editing programs, you're probably used to, having a bottom layer and a top layer and a layer above that. Even in the edit page, we kind of have this thing where if we want to put text over something, we have this bottom layer here, and then we have a layer on top of that. Well, in Fusion, we don't have any layers. It's all done with nodes, which can be a little bit intimidating for some people, but I promise it's not that bad. Instead of using layers, we use a merge node. So sort of towards the middle here, the left icon in this section is called a merge. And if we bring this down, this is a totally different kind of node. Up till now, we pretty much had our yellow input on a node, and then we've had these blue inputs, which we'll talk about in a second. But this merge has a yellow input and a green input. If you mouse over any of these little inputs, it will tell you what it is. So this is merge 1 background, and this is merge 1 foreground. Now, every node has a job, and this merge has the job of putting an image over another image. So we have to connect some kind of node here. I'll just grab this connection and put it into our background and take the output of our merge and put it into our media out. And now nothing's happening. That's because if we walk through our chart here, we have media in. So that's grab that image and then merge, well, nothing over it, and then put it back into the timeline. And so we just have the image. Let's go ahead and I'll just get rid of our blur for now. We'll take this text and take the output of our text and push it into our merge so that it's connected to that green input. And now we have the text over our image. Couple things to note, because this merge puts an image over another image, how it does it is controlled in the inspector. So if we select this and go to the inspector, we have all kinds of different properties about how that foreground image is treated, including angle and size, the center point, which is like the position, and a bunch of other stuff that you can play with. So that's a way that you can quickly do something like put our text over our image and then make it smaller. If we want to change the opacity of this foreground layer, we do it with the blend. So as I pull the blend to the left, this makes our foreground more transparent. And so we can basically kind of turn this off or on using this blend slider. I'll go up to the upper right of our inspector and click on this little circle arrow with the plus in it, and that will reset everything in the node. And now we have our text over our background, and that's how we combine two images. If it'll only do two, how do we add more layers? Well, we just make another merge node. I could unhook this from our media out, grab a merge node and connect it in between like this. And then if I want to, I don't know, put some more text over it, I can connect that to the merge. And then I pretty much have 3 layers. I have our background image here, and then this text, and they're all merged together to look like this. If you're like me, the first time that you see this, you're going to go, gosh, that's a lot of work to just add some text over something. Who in the world would use nodes? Why is this? And then all of your rebel tendencies start to come out and you just go, gosh, it's just so difficult to just make something simple in Fusion. Why did they build it this way? And I'm going to agree with you in a couple ways. The first thing is putting simple text over something like this. This is kind of a lot of steps to just put text over something, right? especially something that you can probably do in the edit page. But where the whole node thing really starts to take off is when you get something that's a little bit more complicated. When you have, 10 different layers and each one's running through an effect, and you're color correcting each of the elements as they go together and combining them in all these different kinds of ways, that's where nodes really starts to make a little bit more sense. But for basic stuff, yeah, it kind of feels overkill. Here's the way that I like to think about compositing with nodes. Here's how we often think of something that's creative, right? So however fancy it needs to be, however many elements you're trying to combine in a composition, however, detailed you want your art to be, we kind of think of it working as a graph like this, right? Whereas the fancier it needs to be, the more effort we need to put out, right? So if it's like 10 fanciness points, it's going to be 10 effort. If it's going to be twice as fancy, it's going to be twice as much the effort. And it's kind of along this line here. And this is honestly about how it goes when you're compositing with layers, right? So if you just want to put text over something else, it's not that much effort because it's not that fancy. If you want to put 30 layers on top of each other, that's going to be quite a bit of effort, right? If you want to put 60 layers into a composition, it's going to be about twice as hard as 30 layers. And that's kind of how it works. Now with nodes, this graph is a little different. At first, it can seem kind of complicated and frustrating to use all of these nodes to do something as simple as putting a couple of text layers over something else. But once you get a little bit fancier, when you get used to using nodes, the effort kind of goes down a little bit. Something that's twice as fancy might not be twice as much work with nodes just because of the way that they're laid out, and you don't have to search through a big stack of layers. You kind of have everything laid out in a nice flowchart here in the node flow. So that's kind of the first thing. The second thing is there are a lot of shortcuts actually to make this easier anyway. So if I get rid of these merge nodes, I have my text, which I'm going to have to make whether I use layers or not, both my big text and my little text. And at some point, you're going to have to make a new layer, put it over something, drag it around, that kind of thing. Well, we can actually take the output of this text 1 and just drag it on top of the output of our media in 1, and that will make a merge node and hook it up correctly. And we can take the text 2 and hook that up the same way. And so we don't have to make that node ourselves and unhook it and hook everything back up a certain way each time. We can just go bam, bam, to get our composition going. In fact, if you have an image node selected and you just click on one of these tools, it's going to add the correct node after the image to kind of help you out. So if I have my media in 1 selected and I want to add some text over it, all I have to do is have it selected and click on text. And what that will do is add a merge node with the text hooked up to the foreground. So it's really about the same amount of effort as making a new layer, right? The difference is that it's laid out in a flowchart so that when things get really complicated, you have a whole map of what's going on and you don't have to search through an endless stack of layers. And you can do something really cool with nodes in that you can reuse the same node in multiple places. So what I could do is select this merge here, and I'll make this text really big and kind of move it over here to the left. And what I'm doing is taking this little text and putting it over our image and transforming it and pushing it to the left. But I can take this same node, this little text, and I could output it again and merge it over everything we have so far. And now we have another copy of our text. So I can use this one node in multiple places. So I'll select this text and say hello, and I only have to adjust the text one time and it can be in multiple places. That's something you don't really get with layers. Layers kind of have to live in one space, whereas nodes can live in multiple spaces at once. It's like compositing in the next dimension. It's awesome. There's a ton to go over here in the Fusion page. I'm just going to hit a couple more key things. First one is masks. Kind of towards the middle of our toolbar here, we have these masks, and I'll grab this ellipse mask and drag it down. And this is just a shape that will kind of control the transparency of whatever we hook it up to. And you may have noticed these little blue arrows on all of the nodes. These are the place that we attach a mask. So if I grab this ellipse mask and I take the output and I put it on our merge 1, what that's going to do is limit the text that's being added with our merge 1 to only happen under that mask. What you're really doing with a mask is you're just telling whatever node you hook it up to just do whatever the node is doing just right here inside of the mask. So if that's a merge, it's saying just put this text over this image inside of the mask. If it's something like a color correction effect, and let's just make this really pink, you're saying just do your color correction inside of that mask. And again, just like any node, you can output this mask to multiple places and have it do multiple jobs at the same time. Really, really convenient. So those are kind of the main basic types of nodes, and you combine all of those kind of things together to make the effects that you want. Of course, Fusion lets you do all kinds of fancy things to an image, and really the only limit is our imagination. For instance, let's say we want to get rid of this little mountain peak here for whatever reason we don't like it. Well, we could do something like paint this out with a paint node. I can go over to this fourth icon over, this paintbrush, and drag that in between our media in and media out. I'll select the paint node, go over here to apply mode under clone. I can hold Control and drag to make a bigger brush. Hold down Alt to pick something. I can kind of paint this out like that. I can track things to things that are moving here in the shot by using a tracker node. I can get to a lot more different tools in Fusion by going up to where it says Effects and opening our Effects panel. And we have all the different tools that are inside of Fusion. I can also search for them, like tracker. We have different kinds of trackers we can use. So I could use just a point tracker by clicking on that. And I can select a feature that I want to kind of stick something to. And I could have it follow that motion. And now that I have that motion tracked, I can grab this text and put it into this foreground input. We'll call this mountain. Grab our tracker and change the operation to match move. And I can move my text to be right by that mountain. And now it follows the motion of the camera. Pretty nice. One thing to mention about Fusion is that a lot of the time it doesn't play back in real time. That's because it's doing a bunch of fancy stuff. Even something like this, when we're working with higher res footage, so this is like 4K footage, it kind of doesn't really play back in real time all the time. So what you can do is enable a render cache. That's just basically rendering this out and kind of thinking about it in advance so that you can play this back in real time. And the best way to do that is just go back to the edit page and go up to playback, and here under render cache, make sure that this is on smart. What that will do is put this red line on anything that it thinks it needs to render. And once this line turns blue, it will play back in real time. And now we can play this back in real time and have it be nice. Last major concept I want to go over here in the Fusion page is animation. Here in the inspector, on the right side here, next to any of these properties, you have this little diamond. This is what you click to set a keyframe. Remember, a keyframe is just telling one of these properties to be a certain value at a certain time, and Resolve can animate in between them over time. And it works a lot like the edit page. I can select whatever node I want to animate. So let's say this tracker. And I can go over to settings and keyframe this blend parameter. That'll be basically the opacity of that foreground on this tracker node. And I can say, I want this to be at full opacity, 10 frames in or so. And then on this first frame, we'll have this blend at 0. And so now that fades in. So let's put all this stuff together and make something real quick. I'm going to go ahead and open up this Fusion composition that I made earlier just by right-clicking and saying New Fusion Composition. And now we can see all we have is a media out. That's because we're not starting with a clip from the timeline. We have to start with an image of some kind. So what I like to do is start with a background. And we'll drag this in and connect it to the media out. And now we have a black screen. Let's go ahead and make some kind of graphic. In fact, let's actually spice up this graphic that we have here at the end of our timeline. And I think I'm going to delete this logo And we're going to kind of animate this in Fusion, make something kind of fancy. So I'll double click on our blank Fusion composition here where we have our black background. Let's take the image of our logo. And if it comes in weird, I can select it and go over to the inspector. And here where it says layer, I can select whatever layer I want from Photoshop. I'll just say merged. That'll be everything. I can also split out the layers and do a bunch of fancy things, but this will be simple enough to do just with the flat image. First of all, let's take this logo and merge it over our background. And I'm going to select a node and hit F2 to rename. And we'll call this logo. And I'm also going to right click and go to Arrange Tools to Grid. And what that'll do is snap these to the grid so that they're all kind of aligned, which I think just looks nice and helps you keep a little bit more organized. And now we can do stuff like animate different parts of this logo, which again, I could bring in as specific layers if I want to, but is easy enough to kind of duplicate these. And we'll call this outside. This one we'll call insect repellent. This one we'll call mountain. And we can add a mask to just the parts that we want. So this is the mountain. I'll hit 2 to bring up this logo here in this second viewer. I have this kind of closed to just be one viewer, but this is viewer 2. And again, we'll add our mask here just around outside. And then again, we'll hit 2, add a mask just around insect repellent down here. And now I have these all isolated, right? So I have the mountain, I have outside, and I have insect repellent. And we can put these all together. And now we have them here as one logo. And we can animate these separately. So I could do something like have the mountain kind of rise up like this. So what we'll do is maybe 1 second in, we'll have the mountain rise up to here. I can just select the merge right here if I want to, and go into the center property. That's just kind of where the foreground is on our merge. And I'll hit this keyframe diamond here. That'll set a keyframe at frame 30. And then at 0, I want this to be way down here under the word. And because we want this to look like it goes behind the word, we can add another mask to our merge. Just take a rectangle mask and attach it to our merge here. And this time I'm just going to put this where I want it to be, like that. And now as time goes on, this mountain kind of rises out of nothing, because this is only being shown under the mask. I'll just update this mask here. And now it kind of rises up out of nothing. Maybe we'll do the same thing for this insect repellent. We'll have that come in from behind outside. Maybe we'll have that end at like frame 40. I'll take this merge, keyframe our center, and then bring this back like 10 frames. And then I'll bring insect repellent up like that. And we'll add a rectangle mask to our merge. And we're just going to have that mask be where we want to actually see the words. So now that kind of pops down like that. So now we go outside, insect repellent. Great. So this is looking pretty nice. There's a couple other things that we want to do. First, this motion kind of jerks to a stop, which never looks pro. So we want to be able to kind of ease that in and have it slow down before it stops. Easiest way to do that in the Fusion page is with the spline panel. Up here in the buttons, I'll click on spline, and that will bring up our spline panel here. This is just a graph of the animation in our comp. And what I like to do generally is just check all the boxes here for anything that's animated, and then go here to zoom to fit, click on that. And now we have these graphs that start at 0 and then they go to 1. So this last keyframe of this first merge, I want to kind of slow down before it stops. So I can take this handle and kind of move around this graph. And now like, think about if you were kind of driving a Jeep up this hill, how much nicer it would be if the hill just kind of rounded off versus kind of go up a big sharp hill and just go conk like that. I'll do the same thing here. Bring that up so it's a nice smooth transition there. If we have that smooth transition, look at the animation now. Comes in and it slows down before it stops. Looks really nice. Yeah. A quick way to set this handle to be flat like this is just to hit F on the keyboard. So what I like to do usually is select the last keyframes of an animation that kind of comes in and hit F on the keyboard. That'll flatten both of those tangents there. And now it can just ease in really nicely. Good. A couple other things I want to do for this little graphic is I don't want this to be on black. I want to show something in the background. So I'm going to grab this background here. And instead of black, I want this to be clear. Easiest way to do that is go here in the inspector. And here, red, green, and blue are all at 0, but alpha is at 1. Let's take the alpha down to 0. And now we have this on clear. That's why we have this checkerboard behind it. So now I can go back over to my edit page. And then I can take this fusion composition. Remember, this is the one that we've been working on. We haven't been working in the timeline. I can go up to this and grab it and drag it down into our comp. And here we have our animated graphic. Of course, I can adjust this further in the edit page. I can select this and grab my transform controls here. And I can kind of scale this down if I want to. And that might be a nice thing to do. We can fade this in just like any piece of footage. So we'll have this fade in. And now we have that little animated logo. Isn't that nice? And of course, we're animating that blur here in the edit page, which I can quickly see by clicking this little button right here. And then grabbing this drop down and selecting whatever I want to look at as a graph. So we'll just say the blur size and the lens blur. And now I can see kind of where this comes in. And we'll just have this start right as that blurs. And I can close that. And now we have our little graphic coming in that we animated in Fusion. Wasn't too hard. And we kind of finished off in the edit page. Isn't that nice? That's nice. All right, let's talk about color. Down here in the bottom bar of our interface, to bring this whole timeline into the color page, all I have to do is click on color, and it'll open up this same timeline here in our color page. Now, before we get started on this, I need to mention something called color management. This footage is red code raw, which by default comes in with a log profile that looks really flat and ugly. But we've been working with some pretty nice looking footage here. The reason this looks nice is because I have color management set in our project settings. In the lower right corner of our screen here, we can click on this little project settings cog. And here under color management, I have my color science set to Davinci YRGB color managed. Now, this is not default. I've had this on just so we don't have to look at gray, nasty looking footage the whole time. But by default, it's Davinci YRGB. And look what happens when I hit save here. We have this kind of gray, uninteresting looking footage, right? This is what the footage actually looks like and the kind of image that we're really going to be bringing into our color page. And color management is really a whole big topic that if you don't know anything about color can be a little bit overwhelming. I do have some videos on color management and learning color if you're a noob. There's links in the description to that. But because of this setting our color science to color managed, that's why our footage has looked pretty good. And the short of the long is that this is taking our flat looking footage and it's recognizing what camera it was shot with, and it's doing some color correction at the end after we mess with it to bring it back to look pretty nice. That means that everything that we do adjusting color really happens before it does that correction. It's actually happening on this kind of grayish image. The advantage of that is when we have something with pretty high dynamic range, that's a big difference between the darkest parts of the shot and the lightest parts of the shot. We're keeping as much information and detail here as we can before we kind of push it to its limits. Again, if you're new to color and this seems overwhelming, don't worry about it too much. But it's good to know that most of the time, if you need to color grade your footage, if you're shooting with a modern high quality camera, you're probably going to be working with log footage. And the very best way to deal with that log footage is to do all of the things that we're about to do here before a color transform of some kind. A color transform is what takes this gray footage and makes it look good on your computer monitor or a TV or a projector or whatever your output is. Like I said, great thing is if you don't know a whole lot about color correction, you can go down to the lower right corner of project settings, go to color management and switch color science to YRGB color managed and hit save. And that's probably going to be just fine for most of the things that you do. If you have something like raw footage, Resolve is going to recognize the metadata from the raw footage, and it's going to apply the right kind of transform to it. If you have something that you shot in like ProRes or some other kind of more compressed format where it's not raw, that log signal is kind of baked into the footage. I'll just import something like that here. We have this scene, which is shot in slog3, and Resolve has no idea what to do with this because it's not raw. What we can do is right-click on the piece of media, in the media pool and go down to input color space and select the color profile that we shot with. So this one was sgamut 3 cine slog 3. And when I set that, that's going to normalize my footage and do a lot of the color correction work for me. It's going to make things that are supposed to be black, generally black, things that are supposed to be white, generally white, add the saturation that it needs, and kind of reverse that log curve so that this looks pretty nice compared to what it did. That's probably the simplest way to start with color, if you have log footage, and Resolve is really, really good at color management. So with all that out of the way, even if you have color management on, chances are you're going to want to adjust your footage in some way. You'll want to tweak the exposure, tweak the color cast, maybe do some fancy stuff, and the color page is where you do that. Let's take a look at the interface. Of course, up here we have the viewer. This is like our timeline viewer. Down below we have the clips. That just lets me select any shot that's in my timeline. All I have to do is click it and it'll highlight it in red. It'll load it up in the viewer, and this is going to be the shot that I'm working on. Down below, we have our mini timeline, and this is a great way to kind of visually see a map of what your timeline looks like kind of in the edit page. It's like a little squished down version of it. Very similar to what it looks like here in the cut page, but the difference is you can't do any editing in this little timeline. It's just for reference. Most of the time, I don't find this that helpful. So just to save some space, I go up to our buttons up top and just close timeline. Down below our clips and where our timeline was, we have our color palettes. This is where the magic happens. These are all of the tools that we use to adjust the colors in our image. And real quick, if this looks more complicated and frustrating than using like a color plugin or using a panel in your editor to adjust your colors, the good news is it's actually really simple and you only need to know a little bit to be able to do some really cool stuff. So let's take a look at some of the essentials. I'm going to move over to my second shot here just because it's a little bit brighter. And for now, I'm going to close this panel called Gallery. We'll talk about that in a couple minutes. And I'll just zoom into this so that we can see a little bigger picture here. So down here in the color palettes, towards the lower left, you should have a palette called Primaries Color Wheels. And dependent on how big your screen is, what your resolution is, you're either going to have these palettes split up into 3 sections here, like this, or they're going to be 2 sections or even 1 section. Either way, it all works the same way. You can switch out these palettes with these little buttons here. These will move to different tools. And you can follow along even if you have kind of a low-res monitor on your laptop or whether you have a big crazy one. But we're going to start with this panel, Primaries Color Wheels. If you're only going to learn one color palette here in the color page, make it this one because you can do lots and lots of stuff just by using these tools. And even this little palette can look overwhelming, but it's really only like 3 different kinds of controls. We'll start out over here with our offset, and there's a couple controls here. There's the color wheel, which if we grab the middle of this and move it around, that changes the major color push of our image. So if we want something to look pink, we push it up towards the pink on the color wheel, and it kind of looks pink, right? This is great for adding color casts or correcting color casts, that kind of thing. And down below that, we have this little slider. This is called the master wheel. If I grab this master wheel and drag it back and forth, that changes the brightness of our image. I can push this to the right and that's going to brighten it. I can push it to the left to darken it. And these 2 controls are just kind of duplicated for what's called lift, gamma, and gain. Lift gives you that same control, but only over the darkest parts of the image. So if I want to make the darkest parts of the image pink, I can push lift towards pink, and that's going to make the darker parts pink. And it's going to leave the brighter parts somewhat untouched. I can reset my lift by clicking this little circle arrow. Same thing for gain. Gain is the brightest parts of the image. So if I want to make the brightest parts of the image pink, I can do that. And it's going to adjust the sky a lot more than it does kind of the shadows down here. And so this gives you a lot of control over what parts of the image you want to color correct. So if I want the brightest parts of the image to be kind of warm, I can push gain towards warm. And I can push the shadows towards cool to kind of give us a little bit of contrast here. So now I have this split tone looking image. And I can reset the gain and the lift themselves by clicking on these little circle arrows, or I can reset everything in this palette by clicking this plus circle arrow right here. And then the gamma controls the midtones. So if I want to push the kind of middle tones down, I can do that. That somewhat leaves the darker parts where they are and the brighter parts where they are, and it kind of just changes the midtones. That works for brightness as well as the color cast. The other major control in the primaries is a little number slider here. And there are several different number sliders. They all control various aspects of the image like contrast. I can grab this and push this to the right, and that's going to increase our contrast. Or I can push it to the left, and that's going to decrease it. If I push up contrast a lot, I can kind of adjust where it splits the brighter and darker parts of the image with this pivot control. So I can push the pivot down, and that's going to add a little bit more brightness to my shadows, but it's going to keep the same overall contrast. Or I can push it to the right, and that's going to darken my highlights a little bit, but again, keep the same amount of overall contrast. So definitely get into all of these and play around and see what they do. The ones I use the most often are contrast and pivot and saturation. That just makes the colors stronger or weaker. And then I also like temperature and tint. If I want to warm up a shot, I like to just take the temperature to the right a little bit to overall warm it up. I can adjust green versus magenta with the tint, and that's a nice way to kind of fix a white balance. And so yeah, that's really just one palette, and that gives you just a ton of control over the colors in your clips. I can move quickly from clip to clip by hitting up or down on the keyboard. So if I hit down, this goes to the next clip. And what you can do is quickly balance out your footage by holding your mouse over this master wheel in the offset, and you can roll with your mouse wheel, and that will change the offset. So I can brighten this up, darken it down just by rolling with my scroll wheel. And I can hit up or down on the keyboard, and I can pretty quickly kind of dial in the brightness of all of my shots just using this offset master wheel. And I can go through and kind of balance out all of my shots really easily. The next palette I would learn if I were you would be the curves palette. Now this works just like it does in Photoshop if you're used to working with curves. If you've used curves in After Effects or Premiere, it works the same way. I can grab the upper part of this curve, and this is the brightest parts of the image. This is the white point, and I can move this around to either make my white point brighter or darker. I can grab my black point and move that up or down, or move it to the right to darken everything. I can grab the middle of this and adjust my midtones, and I can even make kind of a little S curve like this to add some nice contrast. What I like about this is I can get really detailed with exactly how I want that contrast to come in, and I can dial that in perfectly. So that's all kind of basic color stuff. To the right of the curves palette, we have our keyframes, but if you go up to these upper buttons here, the second one over is our color scopes. If you don't know how to read color scopes, check out this video. It's pretty important for learning how to color correct, but basically this is a graph of what your image actually looks like. So this is split up into red, green, and blue, and it's a graph of the brightness of the pixels in each channel. And usually you don't want the signal to go down below 0 or above 1023. You want it to kind of be nicely stretched from the top to the bottom of this graph. And so I can use this to kind of inform my decisions. And so I could boost up the gain quite a bit to give this kind of a nicer exposure. Now, depending on the context here, I might not want this to be that bright. I might want this to be a little bit darker because it kind of has to fit in with the sunset vibe. But these are tools that I can use to kind of help me decide that. Again, I have a ton of videos on color correction, so make sure to check those out on my channel. I'll have links in the description as well. A couple other really cool things I want to show you on the color page. You can actually select certain colors and adjust just those colors. So for instance, if I want to make these trees brighter, these kind of green tones, here in my curves palette, there are these little tiny buttons up here. And as I click through those switch out my HSL curves. What this does is select something by its hue and then let you adjust its hue. So I'll just reset everything here real quick. So maybe we'll pick these clouds, grab those, and it's like this kind of orangish color. And if I move that up and down, that changes the hue of just those colors. So I could make the clouds really pink. Of course, it's going to kind of bleed into this stuff, so I'd have to do some other fancy work, but you can grab specific tones in the image and mess with them. For instance, maybe I want the fire on this marshmallow to be a little less yellow and a little more red. I can take that and kind of push that more towards this kind of reddish orange. That makes it really easy, really simple to do stuff like that. And there are a bunch of different things you can do. You can select by hue and change the saturation or the luminance. And one of my favorites is you can select things that are a certain brightness and adjust its saturation, right? So I can kind of map this to the brighter something gets, the less saturated it's going to get. And so we can have something like a white fire. Or one of my favorite tricks I can take the darker parts of the image and desaturate them so we have these really kind of deep blacks, but we still have color in the image. This is probably a little bit overkill, so we'll kind of bring that back. And now we have these really deep, pure blacks. Something else that's really powerful in the color page are the windows. This fourth icon over in the center here, this little ellipse icon, brings up our Windows palette. And what this does is lets you select a certain part of the image. And if you click on one of these shapes, I'll just click on the circle here. This lets you select a certain part of the image, and any adjustment that you make down here is only going to happen inside of that mask. And so this is great for something like, of course, adding a vignette. I can kind of feather this out like this. And I can take the brightness down inside the window. But if I click on this little button right here, this will invert the window. And now I've darkened the outside. And I can enable and disable my color correction with this little button right here. And so we can see the difference that that's making. If you ever want to reset your shot, go over here to the right-hand side in this node graph, right-click and say Reset All Grades and Nodes. And that will bring this shot back to normal. But I can also just select a part of an image like her face, and maybe I want to brighten her face a little bit, do some work on that, maybe add a little saturation, who knows. I'll just make this really obvious so that we can see that it's happening. I would never actually be this strong on this, but we can turn this off and on and see that difference that we're making. And what's really cool is that this adjustment that I'm making here, I can have this follow her face by tracking it. So I can go over to this next little button where it says tracker. I'll click on that. And by default, it's going to track whatever window I have selected. And I can hit this track forwards and reverse button, and it's going to magically figure out the movement and just move this along with her face. Pretty cool. And this is a really, really simple example, but this thing is like amazing. So I could select this corn, let's say, just go with that. And I'll track this back and forth. And it pretty much instantly perfectly tracks this. Even if there's stuff that kind of gets in the way, it does a really good job of holding on to that. And even after I track it, I can adjust this window and I can do all kinds of things to make this corn look better or worse. So here's before and here's after. So those windows are pretty darn amazing. And what's cool is you can combine all of these techniques. Let's say I did want to mess with this sky. I can put a window over my sky like this, and I can track this back and forth and soften it a little bit. And then I can do something like use this hue curve and select those clouds, and I can make the clouds pink without messing with their skin. Really nice suite of tools that we have here. And then the last little bit about the color page, even though there's so much to go over, we do have to keep moving. The color page uses nodes as well. And so everything that we're doing down here actually lives in this first node over here. And so what we can do is split up the major things that we do for our color correction into these various nodes to keep ourselves organized and separate the different jobs that we're doing. For instance, here we're adjusting this corn cob, but what we probably want to do is start with an overall correction. Like I want to kind of brighten this and maybe adjust the contrast maybe in this first node. We can go up to this node, right click on it and say node label, and we'll call this overall. Then I can right click on the node and go to add node, add serial. And that'll make another node that's added in a series, right? So this first node does an overall correction. And this second node, maybe then we want to get more detailed and I don't know, brighten up these hot dogs, right? You can draw kind of a shape like this. Soften it, maybe take our curves and kind of brighten up these hot dogs a little bit, and we'll track it, which I can just hit Control T to track this forward, Alt T to track it backward without even having to go into that panel, and that'll work. And we'll right click and call this hot dogs. And now we're kind of splitting up our color grade into other little parts. I can turn off or on a node by clicking on its number. And so as I click on this number, I can see the difference just on that node without having to mess with our overall correction. There's a whole strategy for how you kind of split things up in nodes. I have lots of videos on that. Okay, so last little bit about the color page. Let's say that you have a beautiful look, right? So I'm just gonna make this really warm just so we can see what's going on. This isn't the best look in the world, but it's really obvious that the look's on there, right? But let's say that we want to copy this color grade to another shot. Well, the easiest way to do that, since you have a 3-button mouse, make sure that you have a mouse with a scroll wheel that you can kind of click down on, is I can select the clip that I want to copy this color grade to, so this 3rd clip, and I can middle button mouse click on whatever shot I want to copy from. So I'll just middle button mouse click on this 2nd shot and look what happens. That will load this color grade on this shot. I can even shift select a bunch of shots here in the timeline and middle button mouse click, and that will load that look onto all of my shots. So that makes it really easy if you have kind of some basic things that you want to do to a group of shots or to a scene or to your whole thing. You can shift select everything, middle button mouse click, and now you have it on your whole project. The other thing that you can do if you really like a color grade is right click and say grab still. And what that will do is add it to your gallery. In the upper left-hand corner, we have the gallery, and this will save a still. Now, it's sort of a misnomer because, yes, this is a still, like a screenshot, but it's also, if we right-click on this and say display node graph, it's also the color grade information from Resolve. And so it's sort of like saving a preset as well. So you can kind of do the same thing either in this project or in even another project. You can middle button mouse click on this still and copy it to your shot. Or you can select all of them, middle button mouse click, and it works kind of the same way. There is so much more to go over in the color page. In fact, there's so much to go over. I have a whole course on the color page of Resolve, where we start with the very basics of color grading, and then we get into kind of professional techniques for saving time and making beautiful images in Resolve. If you're wanting to learn color, this is the very best way to do it. It's called Professional Color Grading in Davinci Resolve. There's a link right here, as well as in the description. Next, let's jump into Fairlight. Down here in the lower bar, let's go ahead and click on Fairlight. And now this will bring up our entire project in the Fairlight page. Again, Fairlight is all about audio. This is where you really get detailed when it comes to mixing your dialogue, your music, adding sound effects, all of that stuff, all of the audio, everything that you hear for your project. And again, a lot of the stuff that Fairlight does, you can do in the edit page. So again, if you're not really into jumping into another page, you could do things like adjust sound levels and move tracks around and stuff in the edit page. But I'll show you some of the basics of how Fairlight works and why you might want to spend a little bit of time here. First of all, for the interface, the biggest thing is the timeline. This is where you're going to be working most of the time. I can make these tracks as big as I want, and similar way to zoom in and out and move around here in the timeline as the edit page. So that should all make a ton of sense. The main major difference here is we can really zoom in, even to the sample level, which is really, really cool. By default, your timeline might not look quite like this because you can turn on and off the video tracks. So in this upper left-hand corner of our timeline, we have this little icon here, Timeline View Options. Here's where you can turn on and off the video tracks. I like to have them on just so that I have, again, kind of a reference of how my audio is lining up to my video clips. But if you just want to focus on audio, you can turn that off by clicking this first little icon here. Sort of in the middle, we have our different tools, which depending on how you like to work and what you're doing, you might want to play with this. Like this range selection kind of lets you drag a box to select multiple different clips and pieces of clips and things like that. That can be really helpful if you're used to working that way. Most of the time, I just stay with the normal selection because you can move things around and trim them and do all the things that you would normally expect to be able to do here. One thing that's interesting is this edit selection mode. This is kind of a hybrid of these two different modes where you can mouse over the bottom of a clip and you can move it around with kind of this hand, or you can mouse over the top of the clip and just select part of it. So again, kind of depending on how you like to work, if you like kind of selecting a range like this and working with things, deleting things that way and editing things that way, that might be a good way to work. It's kind of a hybrid of these first two tools. But yeah, that's pretty much how the timeline works. Above the timeline, we have all of these super intimidating meters, which as we play this back, you can see the levels of each track, and there are a lot of them. You can also see the levels of your bus as well as your loudness meter. Now, this is really great if you need specific loudness for broadcast or something like that. Works really well. You can adjust the type of metering and everything that you want. The other kind of panels you can open and close up top, we have the metadata panel, which works just like it does in the media page and the edit page. And we have the inspector, which again works like it always does in the other pages as well. Select a clip and adjust it here in the inspector. The left buttons, we can open up our media pool, our effects, which of course just has audio effects here when we're in the Fairlight page. And we also have our index. Now, this is actually really helpful because you can quickly move tracks around this way. Whereas you can't really do that here in the timeline. You'd have to right click and move tracks up and down that way, which is kind of a pain, but you can click and drag them here in the index. Another really handy panel here is the sound library. Click on that and open that. This is a way that you can catalog all of your sound effects that are on your system, and you can have them pretty much always at your fingertips. So the way that you add sounds to your library is you click on these three little dots and say add library. I'll just add our editor's sound kit from ground control, and I'll hit select folder. And what that'll do is scan all of the clips, and it'll remember their waveforms, it'll remember what they're called and all of that stuff. So it never has to do this again. And depending on how many clips you have, it might take a couple minutes. But once it's done, then it will know about all of the sounds in this specific folder, and I'll hit OK. And now if I want to add something like a whoosh, I can just type in whoosh, and all of the whooshes that I have on my system will show up here in this list. And I can double click on a sound to play it. Up here, this kind of works like a source viewer. I can hit I for in, O for out, and drag this down into a new track to add this whoosh. So this is a really great feature of Resolve. It's available here in the Fairlight page, and it's also actually in the edit page as well. So again, if you don't want to go into Fairlight, you can use in the edit page. But a lot of the time when I'm doing sound design and stuff, I'm going to be doing that in Fairlight. So I'll go ahead and turn off our sound library. And now let's talk about the mixer. This is where a lot of work is done in Fairlight. Of course, we have a strip for each track. We have our main fader for each track. We can arm a track to record and record voiceover to it. We can solo mute. We have pan controls, but we also have some built-in effects to this channel strip here. The first one is EQ. If you double click on EQ, that will bring this up with a big nice EQ that will affect everything on the track. We also have some nice presets here, which can be really helpful. So I can just put this dialogue preset here.
Camping. There's nothing better than leaving humanity behind for a few hours to reconnect with nature.
Okay. Also right next to dynamics here, we have this kind of gray square. If you double click on the gray square, this brings up our dynamics window. This is a really cool thing. This will allow us to add a compressor and limiter and all kinds of things to our dialogue, which can really help it kind of punch through a mix. So what I'll generally do is turn on the compressor here and push up the ratio a little bit. And as we play this back,
there's nothing better than leaving humanity behind.
We can see the audio peaking with these kind of yellow dots. And that's really how loud the signal is along this kind of graph. And we can kind of remap this signal to only get to be so loud and to be boosted at a certain point, right? So I can take this compressor and bring the threshold down so that we're making sure that we reduce the loudest parts. And I can push this makeup up so we make sure that even the quietest parts are loud enough. Now we might have gone a little bit crazy here, but we can easily add these kind of dynamics filters to make dialogue cut through a mix.
Behind for a few hours to reconnect with nature.
And from there, with our dynamics on, we can turn these signals up and down to kind of equalize it.
Hours to reconnect with nature. It doesn't take much to have an unforgettable trip.
The other thing that I like to do on my second track here is to add a scoop to the audio to kind of turn the frequencies of the music down where a voice comes through. And so on the second track, I'll double click on the EQ, and we're going to turn this down right around 1K or so, just a little bit.
Than leaving humanity behind for a few hours to reconnect with nature.
So it's just a lot easier to hear.
It doesn't take much to have an unforgettable trip.
And depending on your video, that might be all you need to do to mix it. Of course, if you want to get a little bit more detailed, you can zoom right in here. And if you hold down Alt, you can add little dots to this volume line, and you can kind of push this up and kind of normalize your audio however you think you need to. There's also spots for effects, For each track, you can click on this little plus and you can add all kinds of things like reverb, delay, echo, all that stuff. And that's kind of where you do that. So here, if we want to add some reverb, this will be really reverby. We'll just turn this way down here.
The patio lights. Exactly 6 hot dogs.
So that's how you would do that. If I want to get rid of an effect, I can mouse over it here in the channel strip, hit that little drop down menu and say delete plugin, and that's how it's done. Last thing I want to mention about the Fairlight page is you can organize things into buses. So if I had multiple tracks, let's just go ahead and add a couple tracks. I can right click on this track header and say add tracks. We'll add 2 tracks below audio 1. And now let's say I want to, for whatever reason, if I have multiple people talking, I might have multiple different tracks, or I can move these to different tracks for different environments, whatever I want to do. I can select these and hold down Alt and hit up or down on the keyboard to move them throughout the tracks. But let's say for whatever reason, I have these 3 different tracks and I want to add these kind of filters to all the tracks kind of at once. I can do that with a bus. So what I can do is I'll bring out our mixer a little bit here and I'm going to add a bus. So we'll go up to Fairlight and say bus format. And here we have a list of all of our buses. The one that's on there by default is called bus 1, and that's just your main output. But we'll go and say add bus. And now we have a mono bus. We'll make this a stereo bus. Sounds good. And we'll call this dialogue, and we'll call bus 1, we'll call this main, and I'll hit OK. And now what I want to do is route these first 3 dialogue tracks to my dialogue bus. Here where these bus outputs here say main, I'm going to get rid of main on these first 3 tracks and add dialogue. And those will all go out to my dialogue bus. And then I need to make sure that my dialogue bus goes to my main bus. So now whatever's happening in tracks 1, 2, and 3 are going to go and get processed on this dialogue bus. And then that's going to be sent out to my main output. So if I put an equalizer on this bus, that's going to equalize all 3 of these tracks at the same time. In fact, I can right click and say copy on this EQ and then paste it right here. Same thing for our dynamics, copy and paste. And then we'll just go ahead and reset all of these by opening them up and clicking on this little reset arrow right here. And now we have that same kind of effect.
Camping. There's nothing better than leaving humanity behind.
But it's applied to all of our tracks. Then I can open up the index like this and grab my dialogue bus, and I can drag this up near my dialogue tracks so that I have those kind of conveniently grouped together. So that's really how Fairlight works. Again, if you've used any kind of audio mixing app, this should make a ton of sense. Really helpful for getting really detailed with your audio mix. And again, any kind of changes that we make here in the Fairlight page are reflected in the edit page. And so we have our extra tracks, we have our buses set up and everything exactly how it sounds in the Fairlight page. It's just still available to edit and mess around with and color correct and all the things that we would normally have to go to a separate app to do. All that stuff is built inside of Resolve. Pretty cool. All right, so now we have our project. It looks good, sounds good. We have our animations. Oh, baby, it's so great. Now it's time to render it out. How do we do that? Well, again, if you want to just export something really quick and you don't feel like going into the other pages, you can always just go to File, Quick Export, and export this with a preset, and that looks pretty good. But if you do want to get a little bit more detailed, or you want to export multiple different versions, different timelines, different settings for your project, you're going to want to use the Deliver page. In the lower right-hand corner of our buttons here, we have Deliver. And again, it brings this timeline into the Deliver page. And this is pretty simple. We have a couple different ways to look at our project. We have our viewer, we have our clips, and we have our timeline. Now, this timeline is something I can't do any editing with. It just is kind of a visual representation of our edit. And I can kind of step through things with the clips. But again, this is really kind of just for reference. Most of your work in the Deliver page is going to be over here on the left with the render settings. Along the top, we have a bunch of presets, and you can click into a preset and just render that way. But what I usually do is click to a preset and then I switch back to custom. And what that will do is set all of the custom settings to that preset. And then I can go in and kind of change them from there, right? But you set your settings for whatever you want. All your video settings here are on this first tab. And then as we click through audio, we have audio settings, and then we have file settings. So how you name the file, where you put it, and all that kind of stuff. However you get to that, whatever settings you want, you just go to the bottom and hit Add to Render Queue. And what that will do is put a job here in the render queue. Now, it's not rendering yet, it's just waiting in line. And so let's say we want to have some other kind of export, maybe an H.265 master, whatever it is. We can add that to the render queue as well. Maybe I just want to export audio. I can switch to audio. And, export a wave, whatever I want to do, and hit add to render queue. And now I have all of these jobs here. And if I select none of them or all of them, I can go down here and hit this render button, and it will start to crush on this while I go take a break. So it's really nice because you can kind of queue everything to render out without having to, manually export each one. So this is kind of like something like media encoder or compressor that's kind of built into Resolve. Really nice way to do things. I'll just cancel those for now. But yeah, that's pretty much the ins and outs of how Resolve works. The last thing I do want to mention is the proxy workflow in Resolve because it's super dope. All of this stuff that we've been working with are actually proxies of these red files. You may have noticed when I go full screen, it doesn't look super great. Well, that's because we're using proxies right now. And really the way that Resolve works with proxies is really neat. All of my footage, if we have this little icon right here, that means that we're using a proxy. And I can switch between proxies by going up to playback and going to proxy handling and choosing to prefer camera originals or prefer proxies, or I can just disable the proxies. So if I switch to camera originals, everything looks a lot nicer and that little icon disappears. If I want to make proxies real quick, I can just select them, right click, and I can say generate proxy media. And that will render a proxy to the folder of my choosing based on my project settings. Under master settings, halfway down under optimize media and render cache, it'll be in the resolution and format and folder that I choose here. And as long as you have the proxies linked to the clips, it can just switch them out really easily. So here's my edit with proxies. And here's my edit with the originals. Super quick, really easy. Cannot get enough of the proxy workflow, man. It's so good. And the best part is the proxies will switch out by default before we render it. So I'm never going to accidentally render proxies unless I really, really mean to. Here in the deliver page, under video, under advanced settings, I can tell this to use my proxy media if I want to. Really slick. This is how Resolve works. If you're just getting into Resolve, the great thing is you can download the free version, check it out, see if you like it. And in my experience, when you realize how well you can kind of switch in between these pages and how smooth of a workflow it is to do your edit and then jump in and do some quick visual effects and compositing, switch over and do some color correction, go over and get really detailed with your audio, then switch back and edit some more. I mean, just nothing else compares. That was quite a bit. Hey, if you learned a lot and you want to dive a little deeper, we actually have an Intro to Resolve course. It's available at groundcontrol.film. There's also a link there in the description. Make sure to check that out. Hey, if you had a good time and you learned something, let me know in the comments. That would be sweet. Action. Jackson. 5. Alive. Number Johnny 5 alive. Do you guys see that movie?
Call me Johnny 5.
Short Circuit? That was a cool movie. It was about robots. Yeah.